getting into a little bit about who we are. Vector Solutions is our parent brand, and Vector Solutions delivers online education, safety, compliance, and performance optimization solutions for the commercial, education, and public sectors. Red Vector and Convergence Training, that's the webinar you are joining today, we fall under the commercial umbrella. So we provide training for the industrial manufacturing spaces, the architecture, engineering, and construction spaces, as well as facility management spaces. And to introduce myself, I am the moderator this afternoon. I am the marketing strategist here at Red Vector, and Jeff Dalto is our presenter today, and I'm going to go ahead and send it over to Jeff to introduce himself and get everybody started.
All right, great. Thank you, Casey. Casey, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Jeff. I can hear you.
Cool, great. Hi to Casey, and thanks, and hi to everybody at Red Vector. And most importantly, hi to everybody out there who's chosen to take an hour to learn a little bit about new safety with us. Welcome. Hope you guys have a good time. As Casey mentioned, she and I work for different companies who are part of a same bigger company. So you're at a webinar hosted by Red Vector, and during this webinar, I'll be referring to some content you can get at the Convergence Training blog, some articles and some recorded interviews with some of the people we'll be talking about. So just to clear that up, some of those materials will be available at the Convergence Training blog. Casey also mentioned that at the end of this webinar, you can opt in and receive follow-up emails once a week for 4 weeks. Those emails will include most of those materials from the Convergence Training blog that we'll be referring to as well. So a little heads up, I'm a learning and development specialist, not necessarily a safety professional. I have learned quite a bit. I'm pretty familiar with new safety, but you know, if we ask a whole bunch of questions, there might be a point where I don't have an answer for every single one. One of my primary interests in new safety, other than the fact I've worked in safety and safety training for 10 years or more, is its emphasis on learning, and we'll learn more about that as we move on. My goal today is to kind of point you in the right direction, get you maybe asking some questions and kind of thinking some new thoughts, and get your juices flowing so that you can move on from here and learn even more. And I invite you guys all, if you are on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. I'll be continue writing about and interviewing people over time on these topics as well. And I'm going to share my screen now. And Casey, are we seeing the correct screen now?
We are.
All right, so quick overview of what we'll cover today. We'll talk about 3 different types or strains of new safety. We'll be talking about 3 key thinkers within new safety, 1 key thinker for each of these new types. We'll give you a quick comparison between 2 different alternatives, I guess, to what we might call traditional safety or safety 1. The first being behavior-based safety, and of course, these different kinds of new safety. We'll kind of give you a little history of that. Then we'll dive into 5 specific comparisons between new safety and again, what we're calling today traditional safety or safety 1. And we'll give you some tips on where to learn more. As Casey said, we welcome questions at any time. Use those chat and question functions. We'll do our best to answer them in the flow of the webinar, and then there's a Q&A session scheduled at the end. We think this is going to go an hour. It might go a tiny bit longer. If you have to cut out after an hour, don't worry, you're going to get that recorded version in your inbox in a week. So credit where credit's due. Almost everything I'll be talking about today is coming from 3 primary key sources shown on the screen here. From left to right, Eric Hollnagel, Sidney Decker, and Todd Conklin. We'll be talking about each of these guys more, talking about their books and some of their key thoughts. But this is where most of this material is coming from. I am actually interviewing Dr. Todd Conklin tomorrow, and this is one of these video interviews you'll be able to see at the Convergence Training blog soon, so keep an eye out for that. I've also had the good luck and good fortune to be able to talk about these issues with a lot of other safety professionals in the last several years, and in particular, I want to call out these 2 gentlemen. Bob Edwards, he's a colleague of Todd Conklin's. We'll talk about their hub.org website soon. And again, Bob is a guy who I've benefited from learning a lot from. You can see a interview I did with Bob at the Convergence Training blog on HOP and operational learning. And then secondly, Ron Gant. I've seen Ron Gant talking at the ASSP conference. I follow him on LinkedIn, where he's a very interesting guy, telephone calls and emails. So a lot of credit to Rob, and we've had 3 interviews at the Convergence Training blog. I recommend you, actually 4, recommend you check them all out. And at times during this webinar, when I'm, for example, kind of characterizing these 3 different kinds of new safety, some of the stuff is just taken from email exchanges I've had between Ron and myself. So credit where all 5 of these people deserve all credit. Any mistakes in the webinar are mine, not theirs.
I'm going to give you plenty of credit, Jeff. On that note, so is there one single type of new safety, or are there several types?
Yeah, so we kind of hinted at this already. A lot of people who may not be familiar with this might have heard of new safety or something, and maybe not know that there can be some different strains or thoughts under that umbrella. A couple of the most common ones are safety to, safety differently, and human and organizational performance, or HOP. And those are the 3 we're going to focus on today. Again, safety to, safety differently, and HOP. Sometimes you'll hear people talking about, throwing around some other terms, new view, new safety, human performance improvement, or HPI, et cetera. So when you hear those terms that people are talking about new safety, how exactly that lines up with all these others can be a little squishy, I guess. There are a lot of commonalities between all these things, including safety to, safety differently, and HOP. But again, they do have their own distinctive qualities, and I'll try to do my best to show you the commonalities and the distinctions. And so let's look at safety to first. And again, credit to email exchange with Ron Gant here. Safety to is about ensuring that as many things go right as possible. And also it's about having a presence of a capacity to be successful in varying conditions. So if I want to call out something here about what safety to is about, it's about making things go right, it's about success, and it's about success under varying conditions. Those are things that'll come back over and over again, really when we're talking about all 3 of these kinds of new safety, and in different aspects when we're talking. Safety to is primarily associated, or often associated, with Eric Hollnagel, who we mentioned briefly earlier. One great book, if you wanted to start reading, would be Safety 1 and Safety 2. We're showing on the screen here. A couple others, a follow-up to that one is Safety 2 in Practice. So that's a great next read. And then the ETTO principle, efficiency, thoroughness, trade-off. And I want to call that one out in particular because a lot of these new safety people mention and focus on the fact that workers are constantly making trade-offs at work for things, efficiency versus thoroughness, or how to compete with different organizational priorities like safety, but also get it done. So workers are constantly caught in making those kind of decisions. That's some of the variation we're talking about, and you'll see that thread throughout this discussion. Safety differently is informed by 3 basic tenets. First, safety is the presence of positive. So that's essentially the same as safety to. People are the solution. People are not the problem. We'll get back to that in a second. And safety is an ethical responsibility to those who do the organization's risky work. And it's not a bureaucratic responsibility to those above in the corporate chain. Safety differently is not based on bureaucracy, constraints, and holding people back. And it's not focuses on hazards or risks or even controls. So it's really about this positive stuff. I want to call out this idea that people are the solution. From the new safety perspective, it is sometimes said that traditional safety, or safety 1, views people as the problem and people who need to be controlled. From a new safety perspective, and in particular safety differently, people aren't the problem, they're the solution. They don't need to be controlled, they need to be enabled. And people are creating success and safety every day. So this is arguably a different way to look at our workers. And by people here, I mean the people doing the actual work. It's also interesting here that the ethical responsibility to those who are doing the work and not a bureaucratic responsibility. And we'll talk more about this kind of like criticism of the bureaucracy of safety as we go on, including audits, incident rate reporting, reporting up to regulatory agencies and people higher up in the organization. And a classic guide associated with Safety Differently is Sidney Dekker. A great book to start with, Safety Differently, Human Factors for a New Era. A couple other books to call out, Dekker's Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, and he has human errors in scare quotes there. So this idea of human error is a big, important issue in Safety Differently and how they view human error, and that's with some skepticism. Other books to keep an eye on, Just Culture, again, an important title there that gives you a hint about what he's talking about, that your organization should have a just culture, not a punitive culture. And Safety Anarchist, which is just a heck of a title, and I wanted to call that out. But it's also, I think, pretty attention grabbing, and maybe sometimes people criticize the new safety people as being pretty, kind of a lot of hype and a lot of marketing savvy, and maybe a book like Safety Anarchist, could be, that kind of title could be accused of being marketing hype. And then our third flavor of new safety is human and organizational performance, or HOP. And HOP is based on understanding and eliminating human error through organizational learning and prevention through design. Kind of a typical HOP foundation is that people are fallible, so we need to design systems for the fallible human to make error more recoverable. So you can have an error without bad things happening. And 5 principles of HOP. 1, people do make mistakes. Blaming people fixes nothing. Context drives behavior. So the context in which your employee chose to make a decision or do something is driven by that context. Learning is key, and how managers react matters. How your managers react to your employees' decisions, to their actions, to their incidents, and even to their successes. And going back to the top here, I want to call out that focus here on organizational learning or operational learning, which again is one of the things I find most intriguing in all this new safety stuff, is the emphasis on learning. And if I wanted to call out one book from Ty Conklin is a guy who's associated with HOP. If I want to call out one book, I'd call out this one, 5 Principles of Human Performance, just for a couple of reasons. One, it's brand new, and I haven't even had a chance to read it. But 2, it's the book that I know that deals most clearly with these 5 underlying principles, so I think it's a great start. You can also hear him talk about these principles at his Pre-Accident Investigation podcast series. And then a couple other book titles to call out from Conklin. Pre-Accident Investigations, that's a classic. Well, you should check that out. A second book called Pre-Accident Investigations, Asking Better Questions. And the subtitle of that book is really key because he's talking about the importance of asking questions. And he thinks that's a central role of a safety professional or a safety manager, is asking questions, not providing answers, not imposing solutions, not imposing controls, but asking better questions of your learners, of your workers, and that's how you learn. And then another book, Workplace Fatalities, Failure to Predict. And that's really interesting too, that book, the title, because it's focusing on workplace fatalities. And we'll get back to this issue of focusing on serious injuries and fatalities, or SIFs, as opposed maybe to some things that are less serious. And sometimes in new safety, you'll hear some kind of scorn and criticism of worrying too much about ankle sprains and similar small injuries. And we're going to do a poll in just a second, Casey, but have any questions rolled in first that we should address before the poll?
We have not gotten any questions regarding new safety yet. We've had some, some audio people connecting to audio issues, but no questions yet. But hopefully we'll get some participation here with our first polling question. I'm going to go ahead and open this now. We want to know which new safety school or thinker have you heard of? Have you heard of none of these? Have you heard of Safety 2 with Hall-Nagel, Safety Differently with Dekker, or HOP with Conklin? Or have you heard of all these people? Give us some feedback. I see some questions rolling in. A lot of people, most of the people on the webinar have not heard of any of these guys before. We've got a few saying all of them, a few saying HOP, so that's interesting. Yeah, a lot. I'm very surprised at the number of people saying they haven't heard of any of these new safety schoolers or thinkers before.
Well, that's great. That means we've got a audience who's ready to learn, so that's exciting. So it sounds like none is the primary answer. I hope you guys, by the time the hour is over, we'll hopefully get you a nice little foundation and get you pointed in some good directions. And did you say there were some questions as well, or some interesting chats, Casey?
Not any chats coming in about that. We've had a couple people answer in the chat saying that they've heard of none of them. So, yep.
All right. Well, should we move on?
I'll keep that poll open. Yeah, I'll keep the poll open. Let them keep rolling in. But, yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
All right, everybody. So,
when it comes to all of this new safety stuff, how does it fit in with behavior-based safety?
Yeah, okay, thanks for asking that, Casey. And we mentioned earlier we'd address this issue. You know, if you have traditional safety, then there was this alternative called behavior-based safety, and then there was a new alternative called new safety. And how these are similar and different is debated. And unfortunately, it seems like in this world there's almost never a single simple right answer to any question, it seems. But I'll walk you through a kind of interesting sequence of discussions and debates in safety, and we'll invite people to make up their own mind on this issue. So you can go on the internet and find the video that we have a picture of here. And this is Dr. Scott Geller on the left and Dr. Todd Conklin on the right. And they spoke at what was then the ASSE and is now the ASSP Safety 2017 conference in Denver, Colorado. And Geller discussed behavior-based safety, which he helped to originate, and Conklin discussed HOP, which of course he has helped to originate. And they each did a nice job of presenting their views about what their view on safety was. And then there was a discussion about whether or not these are the same or different. And it was kind of interesting. Geller on the left, the advocate for behavior-based safety, felt that they were saying the same thing and using different words. And Conklin on the right, the advocate for HOP, felt they very much were not saying the same things, and that they were advocating different approaches, you know, fundamentally different and contradictory approaches. So I encourage you to go out and Google this video with Geller and Conklin at the ASSE conference talking about behavior-based safety and HOP. It'll take an hour, and it'll give you a great grounding on that. After that discussion, there was this article in the American Society of Safety Professionals Professional Safety Journal, integrating the best of BBS and HOP. So that's behavior-based safety and HOP. And it was these the authors' opinions, Josh Williams and Steve Roberts, that you could integrate both of these, behavior-based safety and HOP. And that article drew a lot of attention and got a lot of discussion. And as a result, Todd Conklin, at his pre-accident investigation podcast series, he put out an episode on his podcast series about this article and about this issue of whether or not HOP and BBS were compatible and if you can integrate them both. And his answer was no, you cannot. So this is an open issue, and you guys, I encourage you to check out these three resources and come to your own conclusions on this. I guess if I was going to take maybe the point of view of somebody in new safety and tell you what they tend to think about behavior-based safety, it's that behavior-based safety is just another way to put the responsibility for safety and the blame for incidents on employees, maybe because they didn't have something called situational awareness or because they made human error or something like that. So from the new safety perspective, behavior-based safety is often criticized as being just another way to blame employees, as being just another way to absolve employers or management or safety professionals for responsibility for safety. Now, if you're sitting out there and you're listening to this and you disagree and you think, well, that's not a good portrayal of behavior-based safety, or it's not accurate, I admit that this is debatable, but that's what I hear commonly, and so I'm just trying to represent the new safety viewpoint. But if you think there's a counterpoint, I hear you, and what we acknowledge that, and I'll let you think about that on your own after this webinar.
Okay, Jeff. We also have some questions coming in. Heather has asked if we can share the video with Geller and Conklin, and I was able to find a link to that. So I'm going to put that in the chat function for everybody if they are looking for that. Let me make sure I send it to all attendees. Oh, go ahead.
That's a good call from Heather, and thank you. And in addition to having it in this chat, we will make sure there's a link to it in the follow-up email. So if you say at the end of this webinar, yes, please send me 4 weekly emails, we'll make sure to get that link to you as well.
All right, we had someone else if we can share the PowerPoint, and that will also be available, as Jeff mentioned, in this follow-up email after this webinar. So you're going to have the recording, you're going to have the presentation, and we will also include the link to the video. Another question we have from Michelle is, can you summarize HOP in comparison?
Hi, Michelle. Michelle, would that be summarizing HOP in comparison to behavior-based safety, or would that be summarizing HOP in comparison to traditional safety, or do you just want me to summarize HOP as best I can?
And Michelle said to BBS, yes. Yeah.
So I think, again, from a HOP perspective, if you will, and behavior-based safety is a way to put the blame on the worker. It's their fault. If they had made a better decision, there would not have been an incident. Now, that may or may not be an accurate depiction of behavior-based safety, but that's how HOP sees it. And if you go back to the 5 fundamental points of HOP we just talked about, I think point 2 maybe was blame fixes nothing. So putting the responsibility on the worker, blaming the worker, fixes nothing, and you don't learn anything. We'll get back into this point a little bit more, but to expand on that, HOP is really interested in learning. And what they're really interested in learning about in a case where there was an incident and a worker was involved, and maybe in a case where you would say it was the worker's decision or behavior that caused this incident, they're really interested in finding out, why did the worker's decision make sense to the worker at that time? They call that local rationality. You're trying to, they make an assumption that workers aren't stupid, that workers aren't evil, and that workers make decisions for rational reasons based on the system they're in and the circumstances they're in and the context they're in at the time. Again, you might remember another one of those 5 principles was context drives behavior. So they want to learn everything they can about what the worker is doing, when the worker is doing, and why. That's true when the worker creates success, and it's true when the worker has been involved in an incident as well. And they tend to reject this notion that workers create problems, that human error causes problems, but they want to go back and see why a worker's decision made sense to him or her at the time, so that they can learn about the weaknesses in the system. And Conklin often says that workers don't cause failures or incidents. Workers trigger failures or incidents because of the weaknesses in your system. And it's that learning that they want to do to identify those weaknesses and then strengthen your system. So I hope that helped, Michelle.
All right. Another question that we got is, how much does new safety differ from what we might call safety, traditional safety, or safety 1?
Right. So, and who asked that question?
That was Joan.
Hi, Joan. I think it was Joan is what I heard. Good question as well. And we're just about to start digging into that. But so I'll leave that partially unanswered. but as always, it's not clear. You know, it depends on who you talk to. And certainly, they're not, the new safety experts aren't always throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So there's, you know, they're not necessarily, you know, saying never use, don't quit identifying hazards and don't use controls or anything like that. So some of this, the basics we know from safety still apply. But there is that additional, there's a lot of focus on learning. There's a lot of focus on reinterpreting what we call human error and so on. And if you'll bear with us for the next 30 minutes, Joan, I think I'll answer that even better for you. Anything else, Casey?
No, that's it for now.
All right. All right. So, Casey, I think what we're going to talk about here is, and this is getting into Joan's question, right? Which is how different is this new safety from, you know, safety one or traditional safety? And I mentioned that there's not a really single easy answer. So some people will tell you this is entirely new, and they're getting rid of safety one and they're done with that. And safety, you know, new safety is the cat's pajamas. And other people will tell you there's nothing new about this at all. They'll make that claim. And this is just safety professionals who have rebranded themselves in their efforts, and it's all marketing hype. And then others say, like, no, there's some overlap, and then there's some differences. So it's very difficult to find a single right answer to this. And I think that discussion that we gave with behavior-based safety and HOP made that point clearly, where the behavior-based safety advocate Geller is saying, well, we were saying the same thing in different words. And Conklin's repeatedly saying, no, we're not. So, you know, it's not clear exactly how different or similar they are. But I think there are some points of contrast, and we'll call out at least 5 in the next section here.
All right, we want to hear from you guys out there. We're going to go ahead and open this poll. What do you think? Is new safety different than traditional safety? Do you think that it is totally different, both different and the same, or there's no difference at all? We'd love to hear some comments if you think they're both different and the same, or there's no difference at all. We'd like to hear you guys offer some feedback on this. All right, we are seeing most of the panelists are saying that they are both different and the same. Couple people saying totally different, couple people saying no difference at all, but the majority answer we are seeing is both different and the same. So again, we invite you guys, I'm going to keep this poll open, but we invite you guys to chat some of your thoughts on this. So let's see, yeah, we're still getting a lot of both different and the same. We've got a few people. Okay, so we have Vicki saying that traditional safety focuses on failure, where new safety is proactive and looking at success.
Well, that's really interesting, Vicki. And I think you could say traditional safety does focus on failure, and we'll get into that when we're talking about safety metrics and reporting on incident rates and so on. And you're right as well that new safety tends to focus on success, and we touched on that already when discussing, in particular, safety 2, and we'll touch on that again as well. The one caveat I'd mention is that the new safety people embrace failure and maybe welcome it in a way that maybe traditional safety people don't, because they recognize that failure is a great learning opportunity. And so you will often hear the new safety, people from the new safety tribe, if you will, talking about, you know, the failure happens, acknowledging it, not pretending that it doesn't happen. And this is, again, why they tend to be skeptical about things like goals for 0 incidents and 0 harm. And instead realizing what we need to do is acknowledge failure and study it and learn from it. Any other questions?
Okay, great. We didn't have any other questions. We had a couple comments. We had Mike say, it seems that the difference is to change the perspective of pointing out the issues around people and how they need to be fixed with some quotations there, because no one wants to go to work to get injured.
Yeah, so that's point on. People don't need to get fixed. People aren't going to work to get injured. They're not making decisions because they want to get hurt. And so that's that idea of local rationality we talked about. And then I like that point about different perspectives, and we'll go back to that when we're talking about incident investigations.
All right. So can you give us some specific points of comparison between this new safety and traditional safety?
Yeah, you bet. So I'm going to try to walk you guys through 5 points of comparison. Again, just as in when we talk about behavior-based safety, I characterize behavior-based safety from the perspective of new safety. I'm going to be characterizing safety one or traditional safety from the new safety perspective as well. And I'm just going to acknowledge in advance that there could be counter arguments to what I'm going to say about traditional safety. So point granted if you're thinking that already, or if you're going to think that at one point. But again, it's just we'll move forward knowing that we could, debate those issues over time, and I encourage you to give those more thought over time as well. We're going to talk about these 5 points: the definition of safety, procedures in the workplace, incident investigations, safety metrics or safety measurement, and then Heinrich's pyramid, which you might also know as the safety pyramid. And in order to kind of get the juices flowing a little bit, which is our primary goal for this webinar, we're going to start each one of these discussions asking for your opinion before I tell you anything about anybody else's opinion. So with that, let's get into the first one, Casey.
Sure. All right. So which definition of safety is closest to your own? Let me go ahead and open this poll now. Would that be the absence of risk, the absence of incidents, risk as low as reasonably possible, the presence of defensive controls, success under varying conditions, or other? Would you guys have some opinions on that? And while these are trickling in, Jeff, I want to point out that we did have a couple other points come in after that last poll, so maybe we've got some time to go over both, or we can address it at the end. Up to you.
Yeah, well, why don't you go ahead, and while people are voting, go ahead and bring in let's hear those other points.
Okay, so Michelle had mentioned it appears that it's mostly a shift in perspective and a change in opinion on how to fix future problems. New safety seems to be more forward-thinking or preventing accidents through learning.
And I agree with that largely. I think Michelle's correct about that.
All right, and we did have somebody mention if we talked about new safety at the beginning of the webinar, so if you did join us pretty late, that's coming from, yes, he said he was about, or he or she, I apologize, said they were about 15 minutes late to join. So do not worry, you will get this entire presentation along with the recording either early next week, maybe a little bit sooner, but yes, we will get you all of the information that you might have missed. And then we also had Mark say if BBS, behavior-based safety, was successful, then no need to improve. Lack of desired results drive new methods to eliminate or reduce incidents. Do you feel the goal is the same? So it's kind of a question and a comment.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel. I admit I am not an expert on behavior-based safety. I know new safety a lot better. Could you read his comment again one more time, please?
Yeah, let me see if I can break that out. So it said, if BBS was successful, then no need to improve. Lack of desired results drive new methods to eliminate or reduce incidents.
Okay, so I think what you're saying there is BBS didn't work, right? I mean, I think that boils down to BBS didn't work, and that's why we came up with, we didn't get the results we wanted, and that's why we're trying something new.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so with this polling question, a lot of people, the majority of the people who answered are saying that their definition of safety closest to their own is risk as low as reasonably possible.
All right.
do have a few saying, we do have a few saying presence of defenses controls. The next most popular answer would be success under varying conditions. But
All right,
risk
we got
as
a lot
well
of
is
risk
reasonably
managers out there.
possible. Yeah, it looks that way.
Okay, thanks everybody.
All right.
So let me advance my screen here. So it's arguable that a traditional definition of safety is something like this: the absence of harm, the absence of injuries, illnesses, and incidents, freedom from unacceptable risk, or something like that. You certainly hear these kind of things commonly said. You see that when people are measuring safety and so on. And in some ways, these are reasonable kind of common sense definitions of safety. But if you stop and think about it, they're largely safety defined as either the absence of something or as a negative. It's not safety defined as a positive. And again, I acknowledge in some way this makes sense, but it's also a little counterintuitive that the entire field often defines itself as an absence as opposed to some kind of positive or presence. And I guess an analogy here is we don't think of biology as something like the study of the absence of death. We think of biology as the study of life or the presence of life. And you know, the definition of safety is just a little counterintuitive if you look at it as the absence of harm or injuries or illness. And if you start with a different definition of safety, like the new safety people do, it really influences a lot of things. So here's a definition of safety from Eric Hollnagel: the ability to succeed under varying conditions. But here's a couple other definitions. Sidney Dekker: the presence of capabilities to make things go right. Todd Conklin: the presence of defenses and the ability to perform work in varying and unpredictable environments. So, you know, we keep seeing in these new safety definitions, we keep seeing this idea of success and getting work done. We keep seeing also this point about varying and unpredictable environments. So I think that's a big difference right off the bat is how you view your profession and how you view this idea of safety in the industry you're in. And I think that's going to, you know, your definition of safety is going to affect how you practice safety, how you communicate about safety, and how you measure safety, or really even if you do. So that's, I think, one of the 5 points of comparison I want to make right there. And Casey, we're ready for a poll to introduce our second point, but any comments or questions we should field before we move forward?
Yeah, we got a couple of comments that came in a little bit after our last polling question. A couple of people saying we need to move away from the negative and focus on the positive. It's time for that to happen.
All right, you've got a budding new safety pro out there.
And then we also have another comment saying that BBS, behavior-based safety's lack of success, is part of it, but the heavy emphasis of worker as the problem has resulted in significant disengagement.
I would agree with that as well, and I think Conklin and others would agree with that as well. So good points all around.
All right, so to our next polling question, as Jeff mentioned, out there, do you expect your workers to always follow procedures? Do you, yes, always expect it? No, it's not really reasonable, or other? And if you're selecting other, I'm opening that poll now, sorry about that. If you're selecting other, we want to know what is that gray area for you. So we've gotten this open now. Quite a bit of no's, actually. Oh, now it's a tie. It's like a race here. So we did have a comment come in case a procedure is wrong, the worker should have the initiative to decide.
Right, and clearly, if it's wrong, of course, wrong is a debatable word, isn't it? But Kate, point taken, but you know, a lot of things can be viewed as wrong by some people in certain circumstances and not viewed as wrong by other people in different circumstances.
So when it comes to the poll, it's pretty interesting that yes and no are almost neck and neck. We've got a little, we've got a little over half saying yes, but then only a couple less than that saying no. and then, the remainder kind of saying other.
All right. So before we move on and talk about this, Casey, any additional comments or chats before we?
Let me see what else we've got coming in. So we had a couple people say, I don't expect workers to follow procedures. I expect procedures to be created in consultation with workers, and then they follow them because they know and have the desire to follow them as it's the sensible thing to do.
So I think that first point in particular is really important, that workers should be involved in the creation, and we'll talk about that. And then, and I just noticed a feature in the webinar I hadn't noticed before, and I see my friend Pam Lasky's out there, and she said that procedures aren't always perfect. I agree with that, and we'll talk about that as well, or don't always apply. And that's kind of the point I was making about this, the word wrong can be gray.
Yeah, she says hello too.
I saw that. I just learned this new feature. Yeah.
We have Vicky saying they should follow procedures under normal conditions. In emergency or outside normal, they should be able to deviate with their best judgment. Experienced employees are well equipped to handle these decisions. Yeah,
so I think a new safety expert would agree with that as well, and especially like making decisions under those varying conditions that we've been talking about repeatedly. All right, so what was our final count there? What did the percentage break down here, Casey?
It's still pretty even. 28% saying yes, 22% saying no, and then the remainder saying other.
How many others do we have? What percent is that?
13%. We've got some people not participating in the poll, so it's interesting. We encourage you guys to get out there.
On the other hand, maybe they have a day job. Okay, great. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. So you can argue that a traditional Safety One approach is kind of driven by procedures and an expectation that workers are going to follow them. Admittedly, once again, you can make debates, and there are shades of gray here. But the idea is often that these procedures are written by managers, people who don't actually do the work. And a lot of times the new safety people call this people at the blunt end. And we did have somebody already, I can't remember the name, I apologize, say like the workers should be involved in creating procedures. But oftentimes they're created by managers. Oftentimes there's an expectation that people should follow them. Oftentimes, if workers don't follow procedures, they might be subject to some form of punishment for not following that procedure. And oftentimes in an incident investigation, after an incident has occurred, you'll see something like worker did not follow the procedure. So again, you can make counterpoint arguments on this stuff, but that tends to be somewhat of a common thing in Safety One or traditional safety. And this is, again, part of that emphasis on bureaucracy that sometimes is associated with Safety One, and that in particular, safety people in safety differently, but other new safety pros as well would kind of object to. And then looking at this from the new safety perspective, you often hear a discussion of what they call the black line and the blue line, or you'll also sometimes hear them talk about work as planned versus work as performed. And this black line here represents work as planned. It's the work as sketched out in a very linear flow in your job procedure. And again, this is maybe there's an expectation that your worker is going to follow this black line from the left side to the right side in a completely linear cause and effect next button chain of sequences. But oftentimes workers can't follow that black line, that work is planned. And what they do is represented by this blue line, which is work as really performed. And this blue line represents the fact the worker is constantly making adjustments and suiting that procedure to the work environment based on those varying conditions we've been talking about repeatedly. And the new safety experts often say that what you really need to do is you need to study this blue line, and you need to study the gap between work as performed and work as planned. And there's a lot of very valuable safety information here. You don't need to require people to always stay on the black line. You don't need to punish people for being off the black line. You need to let workers make the kind of adjustments and use the kind of experience that one of our audience members talked about earlier at the time, based on those varying conditions. And you also need to develop trust between workers and safety professionals so you can talk about this and learn about operational learning, what the worker is really doing out in the field for his or her job. And this yellow line here, this represents a safety barrier, if you will, or a safety envelope on the bottom side of the screen. And in some cases, while the same thing that your worker does that creates success and safety, which is, you know, working and making variations to get the job done, sometimes that same thing will trigger other events in your other conditions in your system and create what we would call a failure or an incident. And so we're seeing two incidents represented here. And if you're constantly communicating with your workers about the work as performed, maybe this will help you identify the weaknesses in your system and avoid the incidents that we would see represented here. And then the yellow line, sorry about that, yellow line at the top, this represents kind of the boundary of work is performed. And then the spike above it represents an innovation. And so again, if you're constantly studying work as performed with your workers, yeah, you can hopefully anticipate and eliminate some incidents, but you can also capture these innovations and then not just learn about them, but also share that knowledge with other workers to make your workplace more efficient all around for the entire workforce, not just for one worker. So a lot of times you'll hear this is kind of a more common viewpoint in new safety than the idea that everyone has to follow my procedure. It's this idea of workers work on the blue line, and we want to study work as performed so that we can learn more and make a safer system. Casey, any questions about that before we move into our next poll for issue 3?
We didn't really see any come in about that. We had a couple people still making comments about the last polling question, a couple people saying if pre-task risk assessment identifies a hazard not normally present, the procedure is to complete the task and safely may change. So a lot of people are kind of, you know, in that gray area. They've got different opinions.
Great, and if I could go back, I apologize. A couple things I wanted to say here. This squiggly line, the worker doing different things based on the conditions. We talked about earlier about workers are the solution. This is a representation of the worker being the solution, creating success, creating safety based on conditions in the field at the moment. And another thing I want to talk about here, one of the reasons they have to depart from the procedure sometime is they have to make the kind of trade-offs that we were talking about in the Hallnagel book on efficiency and thoroughness, or trade-offs between different values in your company. Like, for example, you know, safety is job one, but always get the job done or customers first. And so the employee is often making those kind of compromises or trade-offs, maybe because and even working under conditions where they have scarce resources. You know, maybe not enough staffing, they've been working too long, whatever it is. So the worker is constantly being pulled in multiple directions and creating safety within that context. And I meant to mention that earlier, so I apologize. Should we move into the poll then, Casey?
Yeah. Yes, let's open this one up. What do you think? Can you find the single cause of an incident? Can you find that one cause? The poll is open. Yes, no, if there's a gray area with other, we want to know what you think.
And obviously what we're talking about here, there's been an incident at work, you perform something like a root cause analysis, and you're looking for the cause.
So far, the resounding answer is no. You cannot find the single cause.
All right. And, you know, that's pretty consistent with new safety thought. Any comments that are rolling in as well that we should be addressing or
Yeah, Leanne's comment is it's very, very, very rare to find one cause. And Michelle says there's often a main cause, however, there are almost always extraneous circumstances.
All right, so we have a lot of proponents for multifactorial or multi-causal incidents. What's our percentage on this one? Is it?
There is 33% of people saying no, 22% saying other, and 6% saying yes.
Okay. All right. Are we safe to move forward then, Casey?
Yeah, we got a couple people answering just no. Not always the root cause can be found. Joe pushed the button, so it's the initiating factor, but we need to understand the context of what was going on when Joe pushed the button. So that's an interesting point.
That sounds like context drives behavior, one of the 5 points from Hop.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll.
All right. So again, it seems like there's a lot of skepticism about this idea in general, but you could say in traditional safety or safety one, there's a focus on performing a root cause analysis and finding a single or sole root cause of an incident. And there's a lot of criticism of this idea from the new safety people. First, and this gets kind of academic and highbrow, but there's a general criticism of the theory of linear causality. And if you want to have to dust off your college philosophy books, read some Hollnagel or some Decker, and hear Decker complain about Newtonian Cartesian causality theory. But in general, they're just skeptical about this idea that things are that simple. And in particular, they talk about something called hindsight bias. So after an incident has happened, when you're looking back on it from the perspective of outside, we talk about shifting your perspective. You're looking at it from outside the incident, and you're looking at it after it happened, and now you have a ton of information. And it's very simple to think, oh, everything I'm seeing now is something the worker should have seen and something the worker should have anticipated. But in fact, that's usually not true, because the worker doesn't have all the information you do after the event. They don't get to sit there and analyze it the way you did. And so this kind of idea of performing a traditional incident investigation, looking backwards or down and in at the event, and with all this information, and assuming that the worker had all this information too and should have been able to anticipate things that you think you would have anticipated, is pretty strongly criticized. And it's a cognitive bias that a lot of researchers write on, and it's called hindsight bias. Another problem with this is oftentimes these incident investigations end with human error as the answer. And we end up naming, blaming, shaming, and retraining. And we never end up learning anything, and we never end up making a safer system, and somebody else will make the same human error at some future point. And so the general criticism is this idea is just too simple, too convenient, too reductive, and ultimately it ends up with no results and no learning. And there's a great quote by Decker: cause is not in the rubble. Cause is created in the mind of the investigator. So you'll hear this over and over again. This is part of that criticism of causality I talked about. If you think about it, there's no such thing as a cause that you can actually see. That's what he means by cause is not in the rubble. You make it up. It's in your head. Cause is created in the mind of the investigator. So you will hear these people constantly talk about the fact that causality is a construct. And again, all these constructs are susceptible to cognitive biases of the kind that someone like Daniel Kahneman might write about in Thinking Fast and Slow. So what the new safety people tend to encourage instead is to be a systems thinker and to think things through systemically. So going back to the whoever it was who said we need to look at it from a different perspective, don't look backwards, down, and in after the event and find human error and stop there. Instead, get down to that human decision. Think about the context he or she was in at the time, and ask yourself, why did this decision make sense to the worker at the time he or she did this? And again, that's that point we keep talking about, local rationality. So instead of looking down and in, go to that point and look up and out, and try to. And if you'll ask yourself, why did the worker make this decision? Why did it appear rational at the time? what you'll do is you'll start to identify the weaknesses in your system that contributed to the problem. And by system, we're talking, yes, about the worker, yes, about the machines, yes, about your processes, but also a whole lot more, your organizational culture and everything. So it's a pretty complicated, rich, interconnected system. And again, here's a quote, this time from Conklin. Workers do not cause failures. Workers trigger failures. And they trigger those failures by interacting with weaknesses in your system. And your goal is to learn about your system and the weaknesses in your system and strengthen those. So I encourage you guys to, do some reading on systems thinking. Think of things as being connected. Think of things as having a relationship. And don't think of things as being isolated or operating as simple components within a system, or separate components, I'm sorry. And one method that Conklin in particular recommends for doing this is something he calls a learning team exercise. And basically, it's, I guess, the three-stage process. He says you can do this for a success or an incident. I think that's a great idea. But assuming we're talking about after an incident, you get people together, people who were involved in the incident, who witnessed it, who have the same job, and so on. And you meet and you just discover and learn. Tell me everything about the job as done. Tell me everything that you did that day. Tell me everything you do every day. And you just try to learn as much as you can about the job and the context that incident occurred in on day one. And he cautions that people will try to propose solutions on day one, and that's one of your biggest jobs, is tamping that down and just learning. Then he calls for what's called soak time, which means go away and think about it. Come back maybe the next day and have the second meeting, review what you talked about on day one, and now ask for solutions. Implement that. So if you get a solution, implement that on a small scale. If it works, go big scale. Implement it and then evaluate it. If it works, go big scale and spread it through the organization. And then communicate those results. And the communication has two benefits. One, it feels good. It's a win. But two, it also shares that knowledge so that people can use it throughout the organization. So this is one way that Conklin in particular suggests using to learn more about that local rationality and get that different perspective. Okay, Casey, another poll. Any questions before we move forward?
We didn't really have any questions. We had a couple more comments regarding, people are still trickling in with their opinions on finding the single incident, and they're all pretty much, saying what you were covering, so everyone kind of has their same opinions. But let's open this, or similar opinions. Let's open this question up, and we want to know, how do you measure safety at your workplace? Do you measure them by lagging indicators such as TRIR, incident rates, etc., leading indicators, both lagging and leading indicators, or none of the above? Are you measuring them a different way?
All right, and heads up, everybody, we've hit our hour point. We are getting close to finish. We have 2 more points we'll talk about, and then we'll wrap it up with some where you can learn more. But if you can hang with us, please do. If not, remember, you'll get an email with a recording, and yeah, you're getting more than your money's worth today for the nice price of free.
Good point, Jeff. All right, the majority are saying both lagging and leading indicators. That's 35% leading with that. A couple people are saying trying to get corporate goals to include leading indicators, but currently we are asked for lagging, like TRIR.
Yeah, so that's,
Mike is saying, oh, go ahead.
That's an uphill battle, obviously, and we all know that that's something that we can't change by snapping our fingers. They want to hire a new organization, OSHA wants it, and so on. So part of our job, it will be educating people why these are not as helpful.
All right, we've got Mike saying the lagging indicators are still seen and responded to with much more vigor than the leading indicators. We're still trying to get people to understand the difference and how one can be managed and the other is a measurement. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's great that he's working on that. And I liked how he said, like, ground one is just, let me teach you how this is different. Ground two
we've got lagging Oh,
Go
go ahead.
And ground two
Oh,
was,
wait,
point
someone.
two is that you've teaching them why the lagging indicators are not as valuable.
And then we have someone else saying lagging for the time being, but they want to try to include leading ones in the future.
And I saw Pam saying, reminding us that Deming says, what gets measured gets done. So if we're focusing on lagging indicators, that's where all your work's going to go.
Okay.
All right, what are our percentages, Casey?
Yeah. It looks like both lagging and leading is taking the lead. 42% saying both lagging and leading. We only have one person saying none of the above, and then we've got 10% for lagging and 2% for leading.
All right.
We had another comment. If we could get large buyers like oil and gas, mining, to move away from only using lagging indicators to assess contractors, that would be moving forward in the positive direction. It's tiring to see the games being played with the stats to win bids.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I was at an industry safety conference recently where the industry itself was having they brought in a bunch of people, safety managers from different organizations. So it was like 25 people in a certain industry and their offices in Washington, D.C. And they had invited the oil, somebody from petrochemicals and the oil industry, and we're talking about the importance of moving away from lagging indicators and TRIR in particular. So maybe there's a beginning of a change there.
Okay, we have some people agreeing with Leanne on what she said as well. So leading indicators, another comment, leading indicators are measures of effectiveness of preventative controls, which are system components. With Safety 1, for example, BBS, these do not commonly exist.
All right. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close
lots of good stuff on safety
poll.
metrics. So if we've characterized fairly or unfairly Safety 1 or traditional safety as being somewhat obsessed with lagging indicators, and I acknowledge it's not as if plenty of people in Safety 1, if you will, are familiar that this is maybe not the best indicator, but they're still commonly used as we talked about. And there are some common criticisms about it. First of all, and somebody already mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't know the name, lagging indicators are about things that already happened. I can't change them. You'll see some other criticisms, like a lot of times we've driven our incident rates down far enough that if we just study our incidents, and there's not enough to learn, and in particular, we're not getting rich enough learning to learn about all the big hazards at our workplace, including things that we might not easily anticipate. Lagging indicators, obviously, is another example of the bureaucratic responsibility to those above that was criticized by safety differently, and it's you spend a lot of time doing bureaucracy instead of that ethical responsibility to people doing the risky work. So that's another criticism. We also know that focus on lagging indicators can at times lead to gaming the system and under-reporting. And sure, there's an acknowledgement that, this is, organizations are still going to require it, at least for a time. Regulatory agencies like OSHA will still require it, at least for a certain time, and maybe this just means we need to do a better job of trying to educate people why we should be measuring something differently. Now, by contrast, a lot of times in new safety, what I read, and I don't always read I don't hear this in one voice, but in general, I read a criticism of the entire idea of safety measurement, especially trying to reduce safety to a single numerical metric. Obviously, you hear a criticism of lagging indicators for the reasons we mentioned. Already mentioned as well, a criticism of goals that revolve around zero harm, and zero incidents, and so on. You often hear, this is from Conklin, you can't measure what didn't happen. And if the goal of safety is to eliminate accidents or avoid accidents, how are you going to measure something if it didn't happen? So if your safety program was successful and that accident didn't occur, how do you count it? In general, I do see a lot of skepticism and critique of this idea of quantitative metrics because they're too reductive. I have heard emphasis on leading indicators from time to time, and Haldnagel calls for something that he calls indicators of resilience, which obviously is a leading indicator. I've heard arguments for using both quantitative and qualitative measures, and often, and especially from Conklin, you know, I hear the importance of communication, of making observations, and telling stories about and learning as much more important than any counting or reporting functionality that safety currently focuses on. So, a couple other points to make. If you're measuring safety by your incident rate, let's consider this analogy. You might just be getting lucky. You might not be safe. You might be getting lucky. So, you know, an analogy is I could get really drunk and I could walk across a crowded highway and I might make it without getting hurt. But that doesn't mean that was safe. But it doesn't reflect it in my. It's not reflected in my incident rate. Another good thing, a couple things to remember, and I'm sure people are probably familiar with this. You know, the Deepwater Horizon event. If I have this correct, they had like higher ups on board because they were celebrating 7 years of a low incident rate on the day that their event occurred. So, you know, they were celebrating safety and their safety record. And of course, they had a massive incident and it proved that they weren't as safe as it might have seemed. And that's because they were looking at their incident rate. And I think the same is true for Texas City as well. So your incident rates can lull you into a false sense of security and make you think that you're safer than you really are.
It's funny you say that, Jeff, because right before you made that point, we had an attendee say the absence of incidents doesn't mean you have a great safety program. It only means that you were lucky.
All right, I got to buy that man or woman a beer.
They beat you to it. All right, so our next polling question, I think this might be our last polling question. We want to know what you guys know about Heinrich's safety pyramid. Which of the following describes the lessons in Heinrich's safety period? Is it reducing minor injuries reduces major injuries? Reducing near misses reduces major injuries? Reducing safety observations reduces major injuries, or reducing at-risk behaviors reduces major injuries? Or is it none of these, or do you have another opinion from the safety pyramid?
And while people are voting, I saw briefly a comment, I think from Joe, flash in saying, hey, everyone says to use leading indicators, but nobody tells you which leading indicators to use. And I think that's a good point. I would encourage you to, go to industry organizations and ask what, people in your industry are doing, but there's a great report by the Campbell Library that gives some examples of leading indicators to use, and we have a blog post at Convergence Trading blog about leading indicators for safety, and I will add that to the follow-up emails. So thanks to Joe for calling that out.
Okay, Vicky's also saying, I don't think it was aimed at reduction. It was intended to highlight that you need to look at close calls and near misses to help reduce more serious incidents. That's what she's saying about the safety pyramid.
That's a great point, and we're going to acknowledge that and then dodge it. But it isn't clear at all what Heinrich intended when he wrote, when he first talked about the safety pyramid, and there's a good debate about that. And I think was her name Cindy? Was that right?
Vicky.
Vicky, sorry. So I think Vicky's right, and she's opening a great point, and I'm just going to acknowledge it. But I'll say that I'm not certain that Heinrich meant his safety pyramid to be interpreted in the way that it often is.
Okay, we've got, as far as percentages go, it's pretty split even from A, which is reducing minor injuries reduces major, and none of the above and other. So 15%. We also have 17% saying reducing at-risk behaviors reduces major injuries. A couple more comments about the pyramid are the ratio is generally accurate descriptively, and any one single event can be significant. It caused us to spend a lot of time elevating the trivial.
Yeah, and elevating the trivial, I love that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And one of the webinar attendees is Pam Woloski, and I've had multiple interviews with Pam. She's a safety professional who does a lot of work with the ASSP. We have blog interviews with her talking about this exact same thing. Don't focus on the trivial and focus on things that precursors that can lead to serious injuries and fatalities. So exactly, I agree with that point. So Casey, I'm going to move forward. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
And here's Heinrich's safety pyramid as he originally depicted it. And see, there's a ratio, 329 to 1. Got no injury accidents at the bottom, minor injuries, and major injuries at the top. Now, the first thing to call out is I think Vicki mentioned this. What he meant might be different than the way this is often has been understood in safety education and by safety professionals. And we'll talk about how it's often understood in a second. You also see all sorts of different versions of this pyramid these days where the different levels don't even match Heinrich's original words. And then there's a debate about where he got his data and so on. But the way this is often understood or has been understood is that there's some kind of causal relationship between the number of incidents you have at the bottom and the number of incidents you have at the top. And so if you can, as a safety professional, if you can reduce the number of incidents at the bottom of your pyramid, you can somehow magically reduce the number of incidents at higher levels of the pyramid. And I guess an analogy of this in the United States, when Rudolph Giuliani became mayor of New York City, he and his police chief, whose name I don't remember, I apologize, had a policing theory that if you just crack down on things like broken windows and graffiti tagging, then in a similar way, you'll just kind of magically see a reduced number in violent crime and murders and the like. So that is kind of idea that if you just spend a lot of time focusing on the bottom, you'll see benefits all the way up the pyramid. And by contrast, an argument from New Safety is, there's a lot of skepticism over these causality claims between, reduce at the bottom means reduce at the top. And they argue that causes us to spend too much time focusing on minor issues. And I can't recall who just talked about focusing on the trivial, but that was the point that person was making. It's the point Pam makes in the interview at the Courageous Training blog on using risk management to reduce serious injuries and fatalities. In New Safety, there's a tendency to focus more on serious injuries and fatalities and are precursors of those. Sometimes a little derisively, they talk about spending too much time on ankle sprains, and they'd rather spend more time on these serious injuries and fatalities. And I'll remind you that one of Conklin's books is about fatality prevention. So I think that shows you how they prioritize SIFs, if you will. And we're going to wrap it up with some tips on where to learn more, Casey. Before I do, any other comments out there?
Yeah, we had a couple comments from people. Having a good reporting system allows us to concentrate on SIS or high-risk tasks. And we had somebody acknowledge that it's very helpful. This webinar is great. I'm curious as to why occupational safety folks do not look at process safety where system or risk-based approaches, including lagging leading indicators, measure of performance effectiveness, are defined and practiced for decades. Just a thought.
And it's a good thought, and I don't know if I know the answer either, but I love that person for saying the webinar is great. Thank you. You're great too. Any other?
All right. Yeah, let me see. I know I'm missing one. Oh, here we go. This was great. She said this is good. Thanks. Hashtag safety by positivity.
All right.
A lot of people. And then, hi, Jeff. This has been great. I highly recommend people check out Todd's podcast. Looking forward to learning more. Todd Conklin is the keynote this year, and both of you are each presenting breakout sessions at the Washington Governors Conference in September. So you're getting another plug.
Hi, Rebecca Llewellyn. All right. I didn't know Todd was going to be there. That's exciting. All right. Okay, so a few tips for where to learn more.
Where can people learn more?
All right, thank you. Sorry, I stole your line there, Casey.
That's
So obviously, I think people should go to the horse's mouth, if you will, and I recommend the books I called out from Halnagel, Decker, and Conklin. Remember, you'll get this PowerPoint, so some of the titles are there for you. I don't recall, I think maybe it might have been Pam who mentioned Todd Conklin's Pre-Accident Investigation podcast series. I recommend that. It's a great recommendation. I'm a big fan of a website called safetydifferently.com, which is put together by Ron Gant and somebody else who I've forgotten. I apologize to person two, but that's a great site. There's a new site that I've just learned of called hophub.org. This is put together by Todd Conklin and some of the people he works with a lot. Bob Edwards, Andrea Baker, and probably some others I'm omitting. That's a good source with a lot of great resources. You can see almost all these people at safety conferences. We just heard that Todd Conklin speaking at the Washington Governor's Safety and Health Conference in the fall. That's not unusual, so you can see these people. I saw Ron Gant at ASSP, for example. I know Bob Edwards talks around a lot. All these people do. And hopefully we have some useful information for you as well at the Convergence Training blog, so I encourage you to check that out. One voice I'd like to call out is a kind of interesting safety professional who actually calls himself the safety mythologist and also the Indiana Jones of safety, and that's this guy here, Karsten Bush. And I really recommend this book, Safety Myth 101. Check out his website, mindtherisk.com. And again, this is another case where we have had an interview with him. You can catch that at the Convergence Training blog. You can read it or watch it in video. And I mentioned earlier, I'm not a safety professional. I'm an L&D guy. So to throw a little bit of a left curve at you, a lot of this stuff is based on learning. And so I would recommend you do some reading in what's called learning organizations. And here are 3 resources for you. The kind of seminal book from the 1990s, Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline. In the middle, this Harvard Business Review article is Yours, a Learning Organization by Garvin, Edmondson, and Gino. And I recommend reading more stuff by Garvin, Edmondson, and Gino. And then on the right, Amy Edmondson's book, that's Edmondson from the article in the middle as well. The Fearless Organization, Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth. So I think this learning organization theory, in many ways, is the underpinning of new safety. To that point, I would encourage you to check out some learning organization and learning agility professionals. 2 that I really like. Again, we have interviews at the Convergence Training blog. On the left, Arun Pradhan. On the right, Michelle Ockers. But these are all people you can find on LinkedIn, and hopefully you'll find them interesting as well. And with that, we'll take any questions and wrap it up and send people home. Any questions for us, Casey?
We did have a couple more comments come in. A lot of people are saying very useful and candid webinar. They really appreciate the book references. Back to kind of talking about comparing accidental incidents and intentional incidents, they're saying, you know, things like preventing glass breaking will not kind of prevent, will not prevent crimes, but even preventing unsafe conditions may prevent serious losses. So kind of going back to the accidental and incidental or intentional incidents.
It also sounded like that comment was kind of indirectly referring to context, I think, as well.
Yep, we're having a lot of people come in and say thanks. This is super helpful and super informative. Any questions you guys have, we'll take them. And as we mentioned at the end, when you hit end event, leave event, and you exit the webinar, there will be a survey that asks you if you would like to receive additional resources.
Yeah, and to that point, first of all, to those who are saying thank you for the thanks, and thank you for attending. I hope you learned it. So, some stuff, it was helpful. Do follow me on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn, and we can continue kind of what I call working out loud and learning together, which is what I'm trying to do now as well. And Casey mentioned the follow-up email. So we will, if you opt in, you'll get 1 a week for 4 weeks, and we are going to remember to add 3 links. The first is some stuff on leading indicators. The second is the ASSE debate between Geller and Conklin. And then the third, we'll make sure we've got the interviews we've had with Pam Lasky, who's one of our attendees today, but she's also a safety expert and has talked about using risk management to reduce SIFs. So we'll get all those added.
All right, let me see if we've had any additional ones come in. Looks like, unless I'm missing anybody, and I apologize, I do not see any additional questions.
All right, well, again, we'd like to thank everybody, wish you all a great day, give you a little award for hanging in, not just for an hour, but more. And yeah, we look forward to staying in touch. So keep in touch with us on LinkedIn on this issue. Know that we're going to continue doing additional webinars in the future where I'll be speaking at Red Vector. We've got a bunch plotted, and I've got an interesting one that we're just now brainstorming on behavioral economics for safety professionals. So watch out for a bunch of stuff along those lines.
And that's a great point, Jeff. One of the questions in that survey is if there are any topics that you would be interested in us hosting a webinar on. We'd love to hear those.
Yeah, absolutely. Love to get your input on that.
All right. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.